My name is Clara Rousseau. I'm a ceramic artist based in Lyon, France, though that title never sat well with the rest of my family. According to them, I make decorated bowls and live in self-inflicted poverty. I was not supposed to be here. Not in this auction house. Not in this dress I had to borrow from a friend. And definitely not in this family. But when you receive a certified letter summoning you to the public auction of your late Aunt Estelle Rousseau's estate, an internationally celebrated sculptor, and for reasons I never understood, the black sheep of the Rousseau dynasty, you show up. Even if your hands shake the whole tram ride over. Before we go any further, if you've ever been told you're not one of us, if you've ever been humiliated in front of people who should have protected you, I hope you'll stick around. And if this story touches you, please like, subscribe, and share it, because sometimes the loudest revenge is silence, and legacy isn't always inherited by blood. The auction hall was all sleek wood, dramatic lighting, and whispered judgments. Everyone was dressed like a magazine ad for quiet luxury, and I was a clay-stained smudge on the canvas. My mother spotted me first, her expression tightening like I'd tracked mud across her Persian rug. She gave that thin-lipped smile, the one that says you're embarrassing yourself, dear, then leaned toward my older cousin Julian, no doubt whispering something sharp. Julian, the curator of his own success story, with his 2 gallery branches in Paris and a 3rd in Berlin. He wore a navy wool coat with leather cuffs and the air of someone who thought creativity had a monthly revenue goal. I walked past them both without a word and took the last empty seat in the back row. There was no warm welcome, no condolence, no mention that for the last 2 years of her life, Aunt Estelle and I had been quietly corresponding, trading letters, photos, and dreams we couldn't say out loud to anyone else. The auctioneer stepped up to the podium, tall and pale with a voice like glass on marble. Welcome, everyone. Today we honor the artistic legacy of Estelle Rousseau, visionary sculptor, iconoclast, and, for many of you, family. A brief, awkward silence. Then the bidding began. Her pieces, dozens of them, were paraded across the stage, one by one. A massive stone torso sold for $40,000. A ceramic dove, cracked intentionally down the spine, went for nearly $20,000. Julien made a point of buying several. To keep the Rousseau name intact, he told a nearby collector, loud enough for half the room to hear. My hands were clenched so tightly in my lap that my nails dug half-moons into my palms. Then came the final lot. And now, the auctioneer said, clearing his throat. Item 73, a restored porcelain teacup, maker unknown. Estimated value, sentimental. Whispers, soft chuckles. Someone snorted. Julien leaned forwards, eyes twinkling with anticipation. Per instruction of the deceased, the auctioneer continued, this piece is to be given, not sold, to Clara Rousseau. I froze. The spotlight swung toward me like a slap. Every head in the room turned. A teacup? Someone whispered. That's it? Said another. My mother actually laughed. How fitting, she said, not bothering to whisper. A broken cup for a broken dream. I stood slowly, numb, heart pounding in my throat. The assistant walked it over, a small porcelain cup, hairline fracture running down the side, glued back together with golden seams in the style of kintsugi. It sat on a wooden box. No note, no explanation. Julien smirked. Looks like Estelle had a sense of humor after all. I took the cup with both hands. It was warm. Somehow impossibly warm. And then I saw him, standing at the edge of the room in his charcoal coat, his hands folded behind his back. Monsieur Dumas, Estelle's longtime assistant, silent, still, watching me, not with pity, but something else, recognition. The moment stretched thin. I turned to the audience, who were already moving on, buzzing about who bought what. My mother fished for her lipstick. Julien counted his new trophies. I felt the sting in my eyes and swallowed it. They thought this was the joke, the punchline. They didn't realize this was the beginning. The night after the auction, I sat cross-legged on the cold floor of my apartment, the broken porcelain cup beside me on a towel. I hadn't even unpacked my coat. Outside the window, Lion glittered softly, distant and unconcerned. That cup, they thought it was a joke. But I remembered the first time I saw it. It was winter. I was 10. The house smelled like citrus and polish. Snow clung to the iron fence, and inside the Rousseau family home, warmth meant rules. I was in the parlor, quietly molding a lump of dough into a flower, while my cousin Julienne recited a memorized speech about modern art to our grandfather. He was 12 then, already dressed like a banker. He'd just come back from a museum trip to Amsterdam, where he saw real paintings. "I just think," Julian had said, puffing up his chest, "art should be curated, not improvised." Grandfather nodded with thin approval. I looked down at my makeshift sculpture, petals lopsided but soft. I hadn't shown it to anyone. I knew better. Then came the voice I dreaded. "Clara, what is that?" My mother's heels clicked across the marble. She crouched beside me, her silk blouse rustling. "It's a flower, I think." I didn't look at her. She took it from my hands and inspected it like a museum artifact, one that failed authentication. "You're getting clay all over the rug," she said, standing. "Honestly, darling, this is why we can't have nice things." I opened my mouth, then closed it. Julienne smirked behind her back. Later that night, she cornered me in the kitchen while the adults drank by the fire. I was washing my hands, bits of dough still under my fingernails. "Clara, you need to understand something," she said, low and firm. "Our family builds things that last. Galleries, trusts, collections, not crafts." I stayed silent, staring at the soap scum on the sink. "You have a good eye," she admitted, which surprised me. But good eyes don't pay for legacies. They distract from them. She kissed the top of my head and left, as if she'd offered comfort. I wiped it away with the back of my wrist. That was the first time I understood what being tolerated felt like. It's colder than being rejected. At least rejection is loud. Tolerance is just silence in a tailored suit. Julien, on the other hand, was celebrated for everything. He won a prize for a photograph he didn't take. His mother had hired a private tutor to enhance it. When he started painting abstract figures, everyone clapped, even though the canvas looked like spilled jam. Once, I showed grandfather a little clay bird I'd made at school. He glanced at it, then said, "Looks like you've been copying Estelle's early work. That's something." He meant it as praise, I think, but I hadn't been copying anyone. I had never even seen Estelle's early work. No one talked about Aunt Estelle much back then. She was the kind of relative they brought up with a sigh. Too radical, too unpredictable, too single. Her pieces were challenging, her choices unfortunate. She hadn't been invited to family Christmas in over a decade. I asked why once. My mother said, "Because she confused rebellion with purpose. Don't make the same mistake." I wasn't sure what that meant at the time, but I remembered it. I remembered it when I won a local art contest at 13, and my mother said, "That's sweet, but don't get distracted. Focus on your math scores." I remembered it when I used my allowance to buy a bag of cheap clay and spent nights shaping figures by flashlight under my blanket. I remembered it when Julien got into the École des Beaux-Arts and my mother threw him a champagne dinner. When I turned 16, I asked for a pottery wheel. I got a new coat instead. "Something respectable," she said. At 17, I started skipping family dinners, claiming schoolwork or cramps. The truth was, I couldn't stand the way they looked through me when I spoke, like I hadn't been edited properly. But the turning point came on a rainy April afternoon. I was early getting home from school and found Estelle sitting in our kitchen. She had come unannounced, her coat soaked, her silver hair pulled back with a pencil. She was drinking from a chipped teacup. I froze in the doorway. She glanced up. "Clara Rousseau," she said with a crooked smile. "Still hiding your hands behind your back?" I didn't realize I was. She patted the seat beside her. "I brought you something." It was a small leather pouch. Inside was a broken teacup. Hairline fractures, edges uneven. "I dropped it last year," she said. "It was my favorite. I thought you might know what to do with it." I blinked. "You want me to fix it?" "No," she said. "I want you to transform it." I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning. The cup sat on my windowsill for years, untouched. I was afraid to ruin it. I didn't understand what she meant. Not until much later. Not until now. I never told my parents I was visiting Estelle. By then, I was 17, old enough to come and go as I pleased, and quiet enough that they rarely asked where I'd been, so long as I didn't return smelling like turpentine or looking bohemian, my mother's polite word for unkempt. But on Thursday afternoons, after my shift at the bookstore and before the tram filled with commuters, I'd slip through the narrow alley off Rue Mistral and knock once on the iron door with the faded brass number 21B. The first time I went, I stood in front of it for 10 minutes, heart pounding. I had found the address scrawled in the back of a postcard Estelle sent me. Come see the mess I call holy. When she opened the door, Estelle didn't say a word. She just looked at me with that glint in her eye, half challenge, half welcome, and stepped aside. Her studio was nothing like the Rousseau family estate. No chandeliers, no polished floors, no hushed tones. It was alive. Light filtered through high windows in long, dusty streaks. There were half-formed sculptures on every surface, torsos without arms, bowls with intentional fractures, glazes cracked open like dried riverbeds. Clay dust coated the floor like snowfall. Music hummed from a hidden radio, something classical but dissonant, like a question that never resolved. Estelle handed me an apron. "Don't touch anything you're afraid to ruin," she said. That was how it began. No rules, no permission slips, just a corner of the world where I wasn't too much or not enough. I just was. At first I watched. I sat cross-legged near the kiln while she threw clay like it was a living conversation. She never lectured, never told me what to make. She asked strange questions instead. What color is silence to you? If grief had texture, what would it feel like? One day, as I stared at a twisted ceramic form that looked like a fist unraveling, I asked, "Why do you leave the cracks?" She shrugged. "Because that's where the light gets in." The phrase stuck to me like sap. A few weeks in, she gestured to a bucket of discarded shards. "Pick one," she said. I chose a broken teacup handle, smooth and curved like a question mark. "Now give it a reason to exist." I didn't understand at first, but I kept coming back. Every Thursday, I brought something with me, a small bird sculpted from ash clay, a hollow cube shaped like a house, a dish glazed in deep blue that ran like tears. Some were terrible, some had something in them, an ache, a whisper, a breath I didn't know I'd held. She never praised me, but she always looked. One afternoon, I arrived early. Estelle was outside, washing her hands at the spigot, her sleeves rolled up to the elbows. A rare spring breeze moved through the courtyard. She glanced at me. "You're early." "I didn't want to wait," I said. She handed me a towel. "Then you're ready." We worked side by side for hours in a silence that felt full, not empty. At one point, she reached into a drawer and pulled out a tiny jar of powdered gold. "Have you heard of kintsugi?" she asked. "Not really." "It's the Japanese art of mending broken pottery with gold. The idea is, we don't hide the damage. We honor it. We make it part of the story." She lifted the old porcelain cup I vaguely recognized, the one she gave me years ago, now in 3 jagged pieces. "I dropped it again," she said with a faint smile. "Or maybe I needed to." I helped her fit the shards together. Her fingers were sure and patient. When we brushed the golden lacquer along the seams, it shimmered under the lamplight. It wasn't seamless. It was truthful. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. This wasn't just about pottery. It was about permission. To be cracked. To be witnessed. To be reassembled without shame. "I used to think art had to be perfect," I said quietly. Estelle didn't look up. "That's because you were taught by people afraid of mess." I blinked hard. "Do you know why I let you come here?" she asked suddenly. I shook my head. "Because you don't ask to be seen," she said. "You show up anyway." We sat in silence after that. Not the silence of disapproval, but the kind that wraps around you like a wool coat in winter. That was the last time I saw her before she fell ill. I kept coming for a while, mostly just to sweep the floor or stand in the stillness. After she passed, the door was bolted shut, the windows dark. The mess, it seemed, had gone wholly again. But the image of that gold-lined cup stayed with me. It still does. I used to imagine adulthood as a kind of gallery. White walls, quiet. People finally listening. What I got instead was mold in the corners of my apartment, a leaky faucet, and 3 part-time jobs. After Estelle passed, the door to her studio stayed locked. Her will had no mention of me, at least none that I knew of, and my family made no effort to reach out. If anything, they seemed relieved, as if the one thread that tied me to the Rousseau name had finally unraveled. I moved into a one-room flat above a bakery in Clara Rousseau. The ceilings sloped so low I couldn't fully stand near the windows. I had no kiln, no proper tools, just a suitcase of clay scraps, a folding table, and Estelle's words stuck in my ribs like splinters. Give it a reason to exist. Most days I worked from 6 a.m. to noon at the bookstore down the street, mostly stacking shelves and answering questions about novels I couldn't afford to buy. In the afternoons, I assisted a ceramicist named Amélie, who ran workshops for children. She let me stay late sometimes to use her wheel when the studio was empty. "I don't get why you keep trying," she said once, wiping glaze off her hands. "You could teach full-time, get paid better, easier hours." I shrugged. "I'm not trying to make it easier." She gave me a look, 1 part admiration, 2 parts concern. When I wasn't working, I made things, small things, hollow bowls with uneven lips, candle holders shaped like collapsed stars, a series of wall-mounted fragments, cracked faces with gold lines running through them like veins. I sold them on a little folding table at the Sunday market. Tourists would pick them up, smile politely, and then buy lavender soap or hand-painted tote bags from the stall next door. Still, sometimes, someone would stop, touch the work gently, ask questions, buy it without bargaining. And every now and then, I'd receive an email through my tiny online shop, no message, no special request, just an order, always from a different name, always shipping to a post office box in another arrondissement. Once I sold a piece I'd named The Quiet Collapse. A week later, I got a handwritten note in the mail, unsigned. "There's strength in how you fall apart." I stared at the handwriting for a long time. I didn't recognize it, but it was careful, elegant, almost familiar. There were nights I wanted to quit. Nights I sat at my work table, cold clay in my hands, fingers aching from hours of folding, pinching, smoothing, only to have the piece collapse under its own weight. My bank account hovered near zero. Rent was a coin toss. And yet something kept me going. Not spite, not even hope. Something smaller, quieter, like muscle memory. I remembered the way Estelle's hands moved across clay, not with force, but with conversation. The way her studio had smelled of ash, lemon oil, and earth. The way she never apologized for the mess. I started leaving little pieces around the city. One tucked into the windowsill of a laundromat. One left on a cafe bathroom shelf. Another balanced on the railing of a bridge at dusk. I called it unseen placement. Art for no one. Art for everyone. One night I returned home to find a small parcel on my doorstep. No name, no note. Inside was a block of imported porcelain clay. Expensive, smooth, the kind I couldn't afford. Wrapped around it was a torn page from a book on Japanese aesthetics. The passage circled in red ink read, "Beauty is not in the object, but in the echo it leaves behind." My hands trembled as I held it. Someone was watching. Not in the way my family had, through lenses of judgment or comparison, but in the way a lighthouse watches the sea, quietly, constantly. It made me wonder, had Estelle left something after all? Maybe not in ink, maybe not in her will, but in motion, in connection, in the people who found meaning in the things I made, even when I doubted their worth. That thought kept me sculpting. I entered 3 group exhibitions and got rejected from all of them. Then, finally, a gallery in the 2nd arrondissement called Atelier Montclair accepted my proposal for a solo wall, a small corner of their monthly showcase. I had 5 weeks to prepare. No money for materials, no assistance, no certainty. But I had the cup. The one Estelle had broken and let me mend. I placed it on my desk, its golden seam glowing under the desk lamp like a vein of buried light. That seam became the center of the show. Every piece I built after that followed its curve. The day after the auction, the porcelain cup still sat on my kitchen table, right where I'd placed it the night before. Golden seams glinted in the morning light, soft but certain. I hadn't touched it, not out of fear, out of something closer to reverence. I didn't expect anyone to reach out. So when I saw the email, I stared at the sender's name for a full minute before I opened it. From Henri Dumas. Subject, for your eyes only. Clara, if you're available this evening, I'd like to speak with you privately. No gallery, no family, just us. 7:00 p.m. Rue Charlemagne, number 12, HD. There was no signature, no context, but I didn't need one. Henri Dumas had worked alongside Estelle for over 20 years. He was a quiet fixture at her shows, rarely speaking, often mistaken for a curator or conservator. But he wasn't staff. He was something else. A keeper of rhythms. A witness. At 6:45, I stood outside number 12 on Rue Charlemagne, a narrow building tucked between a bakery and a shuttered print shop. The brass numbers were dulled by weather, the kind of place people passed without seeing. Fitting. When I knocked, the door opened almost instantly. "Mademoiselle Rousseau," Dumas said, stepping aside. "Please, come in." His voice hadn't changed. Low, unhurried, like someone who read everything before speaking. The room was dim, the scent of old paper and linseed oil curling through the air. Books lined every wall. Sculptures, small ones, rested on wooden plinths, wrapped loosely in cheesecloth. It felt more like a sanctuary than a residence. He gestured to the chair across from him, then walked to a side cabinet and retrieved a wooden box. Polished mahogany, brass hinges. Something about it made my spine go still. "I've kept this for 2 years," he said, setting it down between us. "Estelle gave it to me with strict instructions. Deliver it only after the public reading of her estate, and only to you." I didn't reach for it. My hands remained in my lap. He noticed. "She always believed you'd come into your own," he said. "But she also knew they wouldn't let you, not while they thought they had the last word." My throat tightened. The cup. At the auction. That was the last word. A ghost of a smile flickered across his face. That was the setup. I looked down at the box. The brass latch had no lock, just a simple clasp. I opened it slowly. Inside, on top, lay a sealed envelope. My name, in Estelle's unmistakable handwriting, firm, flowing, defiant. Beneath the letter, a smaller bundle, a leather notebook, 2 vintage photographs, and what looked like a brass key tied to a silk ribbon. I didn't touch anything, just sat there, the letter resting on my knees like a weight I hadn't prepared for. "I don't understand," I whispered. "You will," Dumas said gently, "but not all at once." I looked up at him. "Why now?" "Because grief cracks us open," he said, "and Estelle knew. Only through the cracks would you see what she left you." Silence filled the room again. Thick, intimate, the kind that pressed against your skin. "I thought she forgot me," I admitted. "I wasn't mentioned in her will." Dumas shook his head. "She remembered you in the way that mattered." I finally opened the envelope. The paper inside was soft, worn at the folds. She had written in fountain pen. I recognized the ink, deep umber, almost red. "My Clara, I imagine you're sitting in Henri's study, trying not to cry. Or perhaps crying openly. Both are fine. I know what they did. The cup was meant to make them laugh, because I needed you to see it, the performance, the mask, the mockery. I needed them to show you who they truly are when they believe you have nothing." I paused. My hands trembled. Dumas didn't interrupt. "But this box, is the truth. The key belongs to a place they don't know exists. Your studio, your inheritance, your next chapter. All of it is yours, but only if you choose it. I've arranged everything through the trust." It was quiet, and they never noticed. They were too busy counting coins. "What I leave you isn't safety. It's agency. I chose you not because you are mine by blood, but because you are mine by spirit. You see the fractures, and you do not flinch." The letter continued, but I couldn't go on. I pressed it to my chest, folded over. For the first time in years, I felt something crack open inside me, and it didn't hurt. It glowed. Dumas stood. "The key unlocks 43 Rue Lumière," he said. "Top floor. You'll understand when you get there." "Why didn't she tell me herself?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "She wanted you to walk toward it," he said, "not wait for it to be handed to you." We said nothing else. He placed the notebook and photographs back into the box and handed it to me with both hands, ceremonial, like passing a flame. As I stepped outside, the city hummed beneath a soft rain. Street lamps shimmered against the cobblestones. The brass key was still warm in my palm, and I knew this wasn't a gift. It was an invitation. I didn't sleep that night. The wooden box sat on the floor beside my mattress, like it might hum or shift if I looked away. I kept reaching for it, tracing the curve of the key, rereading Estelle's letter until the words blurred. By dawn, the city was hushed in a soft blue. The streets still carried last night's rain. By 6:10 a.m., I was standing in front of 43 Rue Lumière. The building was old. Wrought iron balconies, ivy climbing the stone, a mosaic sunburst half-faded above the entrance. I'd passed it 100 times and never looked twice. Estelle had chosen it that way, I realized, hidden in plain sight. I climbed 5 flights of creaking stairs, the key clutched tightly in my palm. No elevator, no plaques, just a small brass plate at the final landing that read simply, "Atelier Estelle." My breath caught. The lock turned smoothly, and then the door swung open. The scent hit me first. Cedarwood, old books, and the faint metallic note of clay. The morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, catching in floating dust. The space opened up like a held breath. It wasn't just a studio, it was a world. Along the far wall stood a long wooden workbench, worn and stained, flanked by racks of sculpting tools, some new, some rusted with history. In one corner, a kiln. In another, a couch and small kitchen tucked beneath a lofted bed, shelves brimmed with sketchbooks, ceramics, glazes in tiny labeled jars. Every inch was alive with intention. She had built it for me. I crossed the room slowly, afraid to break the spell. On the center table lay a thick leather portfolio tied with a red cord. My name, Clara, was etched into the corner. I undid the knot with trembling fingers. Inside were photographs. Of me. Pieces I'd sold at markets. Bowls I thought forgotten. The cracked wall faces. The one teardrop-glazed candle holder I left on a bridge. Each catalogued, printed, preserved. She had bought them all under different names. There was a note tucked between the prints. "I couldn't stop them from dismissing you, but I could bear witness." I sank into the nearest chair and covered my mouth, not to keep from crying, but to contain it. This wasn't a gift. This was faith. Years of it, quietly lived, privately guarded. She hadn't just believed in me. She had built a future where I could finally believe in myself. Near the windows, a second door stood half open. I stepped through and found a gallery space, modest, maybe 20 by 20 feet, but already wired for track lighting, walls painted a soft, deliberate gray. On one wall hung a single frame, the broken cup. My fingers grazed the gold seam. There was a brass plaque beneath it. Sometimes the smallest repair becomes the strongest part. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. I stood in the quiet, trying to absorb it all. The light, the smell, the choices she made that led to this very room. The floors were warm beneath my bare feet. The kind of warmth you don't notice until you've gone cold for years. And for the first time in so long, I didn't feel like I had to earn the air I breathed. Later, I wandered back to the living area and found one more envelope tucked into the bookshelf. Inside was a legal document. Transfer of ownership. Atelier Estelle signed and notarized. Beneficiary, Clara Rousseau. Effective immediately. I stared at it for a long time. It was real. No performance, no applause, just space, freedom, legacy, not the kind you inherit, the kind you grow into. As the sun rose higher, I opened the windows wide. The city buzzed faintly below, coffee cups clinking, scooters passing, shutters lifting. A normal Tuesday. And yet everything had changed. I walked barefoot across the hardwood, each step echoing softly in the hollow space. This was mine. Not a loan, not a compromise. Mine. And as I stood in the doorway of the gallery, arms folded, heart pounding quietly in my chest, I made a silent vow, not to avenge, not to prove, but to build. Estelle had left me more than a studio. She had left me the blueprint for becoming. I returned to the studio every day after that. I treated it like a ritual. Mornings began with quiet, a cup of black coffee, the soft sweep of sunlight across the gallery floor, and the sound of my breath in an otherwise wordless room. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. One morning, about a week after I moved in, I opened the tall cabinet beside the kiln, looking for extra glaze. Instead, I found boxes, dozens of them, labeled by year, tucked neatly like chapters in a book someone had been writing long before I knew I was a story. Curiosity pulled at me. I set the first box on the table and opened it. Inside, a small ceramic tile with uneven etching. My handwriting, crooked and determined, signed with a C pressed into the glaze. I made it when I was 17. I remember leaving it on a church bench after my first failed group exhibit. I lifted it like an artifact and stared. Taped to the bottom was a receipt, dated, paid in cash. Buyer name, M. Bellick. I didn't know that name, but something about it itched. I opened another box. Inside, the candle holder I'd left on the stone railing of the Pont Lafayette. The glaze had bubbled slightly in the cold, creating delicate tears. I never saw who took it. I thought maybe it had been tossed, but here it was, catalogued, protected, archived. Like it mattered. Each box held something I thought I'd lost. A chipped bowl I sold for €10 at the market. A broken bird-shaped vase I gifted to a friend who didn't have room for it. One of the pieces I gave up on and threw in the community discard pile at Amelie's studio, somehow retrieved and restored. Every one of them bore the same signature, purchased under aliases. Bellick, D. Rousseau, H. Lambert, C. Fontaine, all traceable, all masks, and every mask led back to one name, Estelle. I sat on the floor, box lids scattered around me, my legs folded beneath the weight of it all. She had been there the entire time, watching, gathering, believing, and not once did she try to fix me. Not once did she make herself the hero of my struggle. She didn't interfere, she didn't correct, she simply saw. I pulled open the bottom drawer of the workbench. Tucked in a folder was a list, a handwritten inventory, complete with descriptions, sale dates, and notes in the margins. Next to a piece I had called Cracked Silence, she'd written, "First time she spoke with clay, not words." By Portrait of the Overlooked, she scribbled, "Unpolished, but dangerous in its honesty." And by The Drowned House. Kept me up all night. The ache of it is real. My eyes stung. I had spent so long thinking I was working in the dark, clawing through obscurity while my family whispered about my phases. But in reality, someone had been lighting candles behind me the whole way. And now I could finally see the glow. I pressed my hand flat against the notes, feeling the slight indentations of her pen. She hadn't just loved my work. She had respected it. Respected me. In a world that asked me to apologize for every crack, every curve, every deviation, Estelle had documented those things like they were gospel. That was her final rebellion. Not just leaving me the studio, but preserving the parts of me I had discarded. A quiet revolution wrapped in bubble wrap. Later that afternoon, I called Amelie. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "You remember the little bowl I left at the studio last spring? The one with the drip glaze mistake?" She hesitated. "You mean the one that vanished?" "Yeah, I found it." "Wait, what? Where?" "In a gallery." She laughed. "What, like, in your dreams?" "No," I said, "in my legacy." She was quiet. Then, "Clara, Are you okay? For once, I didn't answer with hesitation. I think I'm finally becoming who I was always supposed to be. After the call, I placed the pieces back into their boxes carefully, reverently, like tucking children into bed. I labeled each one again in my own handwriting. This time, I didn't write just the title and date. I wrote what I felt, what I saw in them, what I was afraid to admit when I made them. There was a strange relief in it, like the past was folding back into me, but instead of swallowing me whole, it was offering me something I hadn't known I needed. Proof. Proof that I had always mattered. Even in silence. Especially in silence. By the time the sun dipped past the rooftops, the studio glowed golden. I stood in the center of the gallery, surrounded by pieces I once believed were too broken, too raw, too small. But Estelle knew better, and now so did I. The idea came to me in a whisper, not a lightning strike, just a quiet knowing. I was dusting the gold-lined teacup, Estelle's teacup, the one they mocked at the auction, when the name fell into my head fully formed, the repaired vessel. Not just a title, a thesis, a declaration of origin. That night, I stood in the gallery's center and imagined it, the layout, the lighting, the narrative arc, not just sculptures, but a story. Not just artifacts, but evidence, of breakage, of restoration, of defiance spoken in form and curve and fire. I began sketching layouts on the studio wall, taping printouts of old work beside blank note cards labeled with words like fracture, weight, recovery, quiet rebellion. Every piece I selected had once been dismissed, even by me. A bowl that split in the kiln, a mask that collapsed mid-firing, a pair of hands, glazed black, fingers fused together by accident, each told a chapter of who I had been, who I still was. But I didn't stop at my own pieces. I reached out to 3 young artists I had quietly followed online, sculptors, ceramists, multidisciplinary dreamers. Each one had a story like mine, silenced, softened, shelved. I invited them in. No formality, just coffee, questions, and clay under their nails. This isn't a group show, I told them. It's a conversation. I want your voices next to mine. One of them, Leia, looked around the studio like it was a cathedral. Why us? She asked, hands still dusted in porcelain slip. I smiled. Because you're not waiting for permission. We spent days elbow deep in clay, nights with music echoing through the rafters as we sanded, shaped, mended. We burned our fingers, broke things on purpose, laughed when we failed, cried when we didn't know why. I watched them settle into the space the way I had, slowly, then all at once. There was a moment, maybe 3 weeks before opening, when I caught Leia staring at a crack in her newest piece, uncertain. I walked over. You gonna cover that? She hesitated. I was thinking about it. I leaned down beside her. What if that's the part people remember? She blinked, then nodded, and left it. As the opening drew near, I handled the logistics like Estelle had taught me, quietly but thoroughly. I hired a local graphic designer to create minimalist invitations, off-white cardstock, black embossed lettering, no artist statement, just a title, a location, and a date. Atelier Estelle Presents, The Repaired Vessel Opening Night, March 3rd. Invitation only. Then, with a full breath, I mailed 3 more. To my mother, to Julian, to my father, not out of obligation, but because they needed to see what I'd done with the shards they left me. I didn't expect a reply, but Julian RSVP'd within hours. His assistant even requested valet info. My mother texted 3 days later. Interesting. We'll try to attend. No punctuation, no warmth. My father said nothing. That silence, it didn't hurt the way it used to. It just confirmed that I was done waiting. The night before the show, I stayed late alone in the gallery. I walked barefoot across the freshly swept floor, adjusting spotlights, wiping each piece like a ceremony. In the main hall, I installed Estelle's teacup at the entrance, lit from beneath by a soft glow. A brass plaque read, The Repaired Vessel, a study in fracture and return. Just behind it, I placed a shadow box containing the original auction slip, my name next to 0, circled in red. Above it, I pinned Estelle's handwritten note. Some inherit wealth, some inherit silence. You, Clara, inherit the choice. It was my favorite moment of the entire exhibition, because it said everything, without bitterness, without vengeance, just truth. As I locked the gallery for the night, I stood outside a while, watching the soft golden light spill onto Rue Lumière through tall windows. Passers-by slowed. Some peered in, others kept walking. But for the first time, I didn't feel like a stranger to the street. I belonged here, not because someone gave me space, because I took it and built something worth standing in. The gallery doors opened at 6:57 p.m. By 7:02, the space was humming. People spoke in soft tones, the kind reserved for cathedrals and confessionals. Heels tapped against the wood floor, glasses clinked. Hushed murmurs passed between gallery-goers as they paused in front of fractured sculptures lit from underneath. The work didn't shout, it absorbed. Each piece told a story of breakage and care, each title a quiet challenge, held together by fire. Inheritance, rewritten, what you called failure, I named form. I stood near the entrance, watching, not hiding, not waiting, just witnessing. The critic from Le Regard Moderne had arrived early. He lingered long at the wall of discarded works, where I'd installed a handwritten placard that read, "All of these were once considered unworthy. Now they hold a room together." He raised his eyebrows and scribbled something in his notebook. That was enough. Then came the sound I'd expected. Familiar. The sharp click of designer heels. My mother. She entered with that curated stillness she wore to galas and charity auctions. Pearl earrings, silk blouse, not a hair out of place. Her eyes scanned the space like it was a hotel lobby she hadn't approved of. Julien followed 2 steps behind, in a blazer a shade too loud and confidence that didn't quite fit. His gaze was half curious, half calculating, the kind of look people wear when they realize they've been left out of something and don't know how big the thing is yet. And finally, my father. Hands behind his back, face unreadable. The only hint of discomfort was how long he stood just inside the threshold, like the floor might not hold him. None of them approached me. Not at first. They made a slow circuit, moving from piece to piece, passing commentary between each other in near whispers. I watched my mother's mouth tighten as she read the placard beneath the drowned house. Watched Julien pause at the wall titled Unsponsored. Watched my father stand in front of Estelle's cup for so long I thought he might walk out. He didn't. Instead, he turned, slowly, and met my eyes from across the room. He didn't blink. I didn't either. A minute passed. Maybe 2. Then he looked away. When the crowd finally thinned and the soft music faded into evening light, Julien was the first to break the distance. "This is all... you?" he asked, gesturing vaguely around the space. "Yes," I said. He nodded, like he couldn't quite decide if that was impressive or threatening. "Since when do you run this place?" I tilted my head slightly. "Since I stopped waiting for someone else to." My mother approached next. She clasped her purse with both hands, lips painted but tight. "This is ambitious," she said, eyes flicking to the nearest sculpture. "Did someone sponsor this?" "No," I said gently. "Just one person who believed in me." She looked like she wanted to say more, but couldn't find words that wouldn't taste like regret. Then my father stepped forward. He stood in front of me for a long moment, his gaze heavy, not cruel, just confused. "All this," he said. "It was her idea?" "No," I replied. "It was mine, but she made sure I had the tools to build it." He looked over his shoulder, as if trying to find something to anchor him. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "You did all this without us." I let the silence linger before answering. "Yes, and maybe because of you." He winced, just barely, but it was there. "We're still your family, Clara," my mother said suddenly, voice sharpening. "You don't have to." "I know what I have to do," I cut in calmly, "and it's not apologizing for the space I've made." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply stood there, surrounded by work they once called distractions. I invited you, I added, not to forgive, not to fight, but to witness. None of them responded, because there was nothing to say. Eventually, Julienne gave a short nod, whether in approval or defeat, I couldn't tell, and turned back to the champagne. My mother looked down at her shoes. My father drifted back toward the exit, but I didn't follow. Instead, I walked to the center of the gallery where the repaired vessel, the final piece, stood beneath a halo of light. It wasn't flashy, just a bowl cracked in 3 places, sealed with gold. Beneath it, a plaque. To be broken and remade is not failure. It's how you learn to hold light. I closed my eyes for a breath. Around me, the gallery was full of strangers and kindreds, people who didn't need to know every detail to feel what lived in the seams. When I opened my eyes, they were still watching, but this time not with judgment, with awe. I didn't need applause. I had silence. And silence, when it's earned, is thunderous. The last guest left just before midnight. Their footsteps faded down Rue Lumière, swallowed by the hush of old stone and soft streetlight. I stood at the gallery door for a long while after, my hand resting on the lock but never turning it. I didn't want to close it. Not yet. The space was still full, not with noise or people but with presence. The scent of clay lingered in the corners. Empty glasses sat on the reception counter. Crumbs from delicate pastries dotted the edge of a table no one had touched during the show. But it wasn't messy. It was lived in, like breath after silence. I slipped off my heels, padded barefoot across the warm floorboards, and turned off the overhead lights, one by one, until only the gallery's main spotlight remained. It shone on the repaired vessel. The bowl sat centered on its plinth, gold seams glowing like veins of light. It wasn't precious because it was perfect. It was precious because it had survived being broken. I sat down on the floor in front of it, cross-legged like a child, and for the first time all day I let myself exhale. The truth is, I didn't know this night would come. When I left my parents' house at 21, I thought I was walking away from a door that would never open again. I had no savings, no backup plan, only clay under my fingernails and a voice in my head that didn't belong to me yet, but whispered anyway. Try. I worked jobs no one noticed, took rejections like vitamins, and sculpted in corners no one saw. For a long time, I thought that meant I wasn't doing it right. But now I understand. I wasn't unseen. I was just early. Estelle knew. She saw the cracks before I did, and didn't flinch. She didn't rescue me. She equipped me, with this space, with her silence, with her faith. And tonight, standing in this gallery filled with the work I once buried, I realize I never needed permission. I only needed one person to believe I was worth the risk. And eventually, that person became me. I got up and walked into the studio. The walls were covered in sketches and notes now, the once empty shelves filled with works in progress, tools, handprints, the kind of glorious clutter that says, someone is building here. I passed the table where I'd laid out the archive, box after box of pieces Estelle had saved. I ran my fingers over the edge of one. The quiet collapse. A small sculpture I had once thrown in frustration. She had kept it anyway. Behind the curtain near the back wall, a string of fairy lights glowed above the lofted bed. I climbed the ladder and sat beneath them, knees tucked to my chest. It felt like she was here, not in ghost or memory, but in the way the room exhaled around me. I reached into the drawer of the nightstand. Inside was the final letter. I'd found it 2 days before the opening, tucked beneath the lining. On the envelope, one word. Later. Now was later. I opened it slowly, carefully. Her handwriting curved like always, confident and just a little wild. Clara, if you're reading this, then you've made something beautiful. Not just art, but space. For yourself, for others, for breath. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you unlock in others. You were always the one I believed in. I just needed you to believe it too. Don't become someone they finally understand. Become someone they can't look away from. Estelle. I held the letter to my chest for a long time, and then I cried. Not from sadness, not even from joy. From release. As the night deepened, I wandered back into the gallery. The bowl still glowed in the dark. I opened the front door again and stepped out barefoot onto the cobbled street. The air was crisp. A couple passed by, hand in hand. A cyclist glided by in silence. I turned back to look at Atelier Estelle. From outside, you could see the whole gallery bathed in low light. Pieces lined the walls, their shadows stretching upward like prayers. And right at the front, glowing quietly, was the bowl. The repaired vessel. A stranger paused beside me and tilted his head toward the window. "What's in there?" he asked. I smiled. A reminder. Of what? I looked back at the bowl. That even when you've been broken, you can still hold light. I used to think being seen meant standing at the center of the room. Now I know. Real presence isn't about visibility. It's about truth. It's about showing up, even when no one's clapping. It's about taking the pieces you were told to hide and making them sing. If you're listening to this and you've ever been made to feel like a cracked cup, too delicate, too strange, too far gone, I hope you know you don't need fixing. You need framing. So build the space. Fill it with your voice. Leave the door open behind you. Someone else will need it. If this story touched you, please like, subscribe, share, and leave a comment below. Let us know. What's the part of yourself you've been told to hide that might just be your strongest vessel? You never know who's waiting to hear your story, and you never know who's already watching, quietly believing